Hi there, so I'm Dr. Tess Peterson and this is my colleague Dr. Shal Rapsey. We're going to co-present. We've never done this dance before, so I'm not sure how it's going to go, but we're going to have a go at it. So I'm just going to begin, I guess in terms of the introduction, it's going to be fairly brief because I feel that we all have the same starting point. In terms of that, I'll just check. In terms of male childhood sexual abuse, what we do know is we all know that male sexual abuse happens. It doesn't just happen to females. We also know it's not uncommon. Prevalence rates range from 3% up to 17, sometimes 29% depending on the study. But what we know is that large reviews show that on average approximately 8% of males will be sexually abused by the age of 18. We all know the harm done. We've been talking about it here today. This is not something that is unfamiliar with anyone here. When we look at the impact of male childhood sexual abuse, research to date shows that it actually has very adverse outcome on a number of mental health disorders. So major depression, substance abuse, post-traumatic stress disorder, we've heard about suicidality. But it's not just the mental disorders, it also really impacts on relationships, sexual relationships, relationships with others, and even poor health outcomes. Okay, so when we look at the type of research that's being done, I want to talk about the outcome research about those adverse impacts that somebody might have increased risk for everybody had potential to do something abusive. The relationships with children, again, we got really varied responses in terms of how male survivors of childhood sexual abuse felt about their relationships with children. So some of them had really good relationships with their children, and some felt they had poor relationships because of the abuse. Some of the survivors were really comfortable around children, and others weren't comfortable at all. Some of them talked about an awareness to potentially abuse, or more an awareness to be seen to be an abuser, or what are you doing with that child? So here are some examples. One person said, I'm not a bad person. My kids are well-rounded, well-adjusted girls, you know, and I've done a good job with them, and I've probably been a bit overprotective and stuff like that. Another one talked about with his 2 daughters, I was frightened to bathe them, not because I would touch them, but that someone might come in and say, what are you doing? And another one talked about an unusual experience at a person's house where this 3-year-old came running at him after a bath with just a towel around him. He said he jumps on top of me naked, and it just feels weird, but more kind of worried. What are the other people thinking when there's nothing happening? So again, we kind of got this whole theme of control coming through. It's showing how it's influencing their relationships, even into adulthood and all of the relationships. Another main theme that came about was the disclosure of abuse to others. So at the time of abuse, when these guys were young, most of them or many of them did not disclose. And others talked also about, if they did disclose, not getting a supportive response to that disclosure, either as a child or later in life. Most talked about later in life, though, they were able to tell people and that it was helpful to disclose, that they were able to have conversations with people they trusted and feel supported. So here's a quote from someone who didn't disclose. He loved me, that's how it was put across, and it was okay. I don't know how he kept me quiet about it, I don't know. I don't think he ever used fear, I don't think he ever threatened me or anything like that. I don't know how he kept me silent. Another one talked about the fear of breaking my family up, the fear of Dad going to prison and what he would do to me, therefore the non-disclosure. Others talked about disclosing but not feeling supported. So the day we went home from the police station, so that was after it had become known, that was it. It was never talked about again. I'm a boy, I'll grow up and I'll toughen up. I'll be okay. So there was nothing. My dad just didn't say anything. So in terms of relating it back to that theme of control, it shows kind of the control that the abuser had over children in terms of them keeping quiet and not being able to disclose. But that they got some control back later as adults as they began to talk to other people and disclose what had happened to them. Now this is kind of the last theme that emerged, or the end of the story, but of course it didn't unravel like that. All these themes were coming out in the transcripts, but this theme again was dominant, trying to get a sense of meaning about the abuse. And the men talked about it in a number of ways. They said they wanted to try and find the meaning of it. They wanted to get a different perspective on themselves and the abuser, and they wanted to help others. They also began to look at the abuse in the context of their overall life. So it wasn't just this thing that happened then, but they were reflecting on what had occurred. And they definitely talked about wanting to take back control of their life. If you can listen to these quotes, because these quotes kind of say one thing and then say another. So if we can look at that. So one of the survivors said, I'm trying to fix myself and I don't want to carry that pain, the hatred, the anger, the hurt. I just don't want to be carrying that anymore. I'm getting too old in the tooth. I'm trying to have a relationship and a life, and they've contributed to me not being able to have these things. That I'm still struggling to this today to have any of those things. So this is this want, this is this hope, this is this try to fix things, try to move on, try to get back control of their life. Another person said, on the other hand, I'm really thrilled with myself that I've turned from a victim to a survivor at some point. But on the other, I'm a waste. I've wrecked relationships, not able to concentrate. Sometimes I think what I could have done if I hadn't have had that. but then I'm more satisfied with my life, to be honest. So this was kind of this point of, actually, I've moved forward. I've taken back some of what was lost from me, but then also acknowledging that at times it would still creep in. We didn't identify it as a theme, but this kind of what they had lost in terms of who they could have been if the abuse had never happened came through with quite a few men. One of them said, I'm able to talk about them a lot easier now than I have in the past. I've got to the stage where A, it happened and it doesn't control me anymore. But in saying that, there's still, when you get triggered, you go back. Strengths were also acknowledged, that they'd come through it and that they were stronger or more aware because of it. So one of the survivors said, I don't give them any real thought. He was talking about the abusers. When I do think about it in my own life during the day, when something comes up or whatever, I reflect on how they've made me a stronger person, how they've allowed me to learn skills and tools that not many people have the opportunity to do so, how I'm still alive. So I thank them for those lessons and I use them in my work, so I use it as a strength. So in summary, when we look at the impact of childhood sexual abuse, for these men it was profound, it was deep. It began at the time of abuse and it was ongoing and affected most aspects of their life. When I talk about the control, I suppose it's not just someone controlling you, but also the way in which it influenced or controlled the life and how that life developed and how that was typically negative. Now, when I came to the end, so we get that theme about meaning and strength and hope. And I kind of had this sense that I wanted a happy ending here. I wanted to be able to say, actually it happened, it was terrible, there's a struggle, people get through it, they survive, and then they're better, and then we have our happy ending. But I think what you see with the quotes is that there's some happy ending, but not a total happy ending. People still talk about struggling, so on a good day it's fine. When they're vulnerable or they're triggered, they're not fine anymore. So the idea of a kind of a one-off place where people can stop, which was what I was hoping to hear, isn't there. And I think what it shows is that there's still storms to be weathered and they will be ongoing. But I think that what we're also seeing from the men is that story of hope and that they are survivors and they do get and weather these storms. I'll just turn it over to Charles now.
Okay, so I'm going to try really hard to push two buttons at the same time. So we did 2 studies with the same group of men, and in this second study, we looked at engagement in therapy. And so when we talk about therapy or treatment, I sometimes say, we're talking about talking to any professional person. So whether that's a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a counsellor or a psychotherapist. So overall, 7 of the 9 men reported benefiting from therapy. 1 man reported no benefit, and 1 man reported that he hadn't engaged in therapy specifically for sexual abuse. Okay, so the men in the study had different stories about engaging in therapy, but overall 3 themes emerged that I want to go over. So the first theme, we've called it motivation, but it's around participants' experience of deciding to get therapy, so that internal or external drive towards therapy, and then some of the barriers or obstacles that got in the way, that intervened with that motivation. Men described stigma around therapy as a barrier to seeking help. So they thought they'd be judged or ridiculed. Simon explained this idea. He said, I think it's that shame, that weak, if I need help, I'm weak. Those were the things that would have stopped me years ago getting help. Even though people told me I needed help, I avoided it. And also people wouldn't understand me and stuff like that, and didn't want to get judged. That was a huge one. That's the same as the forms in that. It's as if you're getting judged, and things like that. And the fear that someone might not believe me was awful. Okay, so as well as stigma, Simon referred to the forms. And so this was another theme related to motivation, the process around accessing treatment. And we've heard from ACC today, and there have been substantial changes in the process of getting ACC, but some of them, ACC helped, but some of the men were referring to experiences several years ago. And there were problems, there were costs associated with therapy, or it was difficult to know where to go, who to talk to. The process of engaging in therapy with ACC involves disclosure of sexual abuse at the beginning of that process, and that in itself can be a barrier. Ray also discussed the power differential in the therapy process. He said initially it was a nervousness about the process. It's a little bit daunting in a way when I think back now that you go into a room with someone and the door is shut. There's a parallel immediately with abuse. It's usually in isolation with the abuser and victim sort of thing. So yeah, I guess there's a little bit of that come into it. Despite pretty substantial barriers, many of the men in this study described strong motivation to grow and to heal and saw therapy as part of that process. Peter said, "I wanted to understand myself more so that I could accept why I was like that. It's a difficult thing to explain. Don't know who you are sort of thing. I wanted to be me, not something that I felt was manufactured by events sort of. I just felt that everything I did was influenced by my past and shaped by those events, and I wanted to become my own person, so to speak." And Jason also described strong motives to change. He said, "I don't want to be that person wearing my armour anymore. I don't think I'm tough and staunch. I just think I'm screwed up. I just want to have a bit of a, I don't want to say normal because I don't know what it is. I just want to have a better life. I've just had enough of the anger and I've just had enough of it and I can't go deal with it in the wrong way because of the obvious results. And I just don't want to live like that anymore. Simple as that." So then our second theme connects in with that first theme as well. Is around developing a connection or a relationship with treatment providers. So this is rapport, relationship, trust. All participants who reported that they'd benefited from therapy had found one therapist that they could trust and they felt comfortable and safe with. The two men who didn't get any benefit from therapy didn't describe strong connections with their therapists. So Andrew said, "I'd seen a couple of psychologists through CADS, but I didn't really connect with too many people that I could open up to around my addictions, yet alone my abuse. My treatment for my addictions wasn't that helpful sometimes as far as professional people were concerned. So I disclose it to friends more than I would any professional person. So it's about the person's own ability as opposed to the qualifications they've got. For me, I haven't met very many people who can listen to what I have to say, and I've had bad experiences." Whereas other participants did describe experiencing strong connections with therapists. However, usually this connection only came after seeing a number of professionals. So to find that person that they connected with required perseverance. Peter said, "Yeah, so with the psychiatrists and psychologists and counsellors and all that, I only connected with my last counsellor. I guess because I never discussed things properly with them, I don't know whether they would have accepted me, or I got that feeling from a couple of counsellors, so I didn't go any further. And the biggest thing for me in all of it is just being honest and saying how it was and the results of it." This fear of not being accepted or understood was common. participants described worrying that the professionals that they talked to wouldn't be capable of coping with or sitting with their disclosures. In others, this had actively got in the way for some participants, where they had been unable to develop rapport with professionals because it felt that the professionals actively avoided discussing the issues. So Jason described an appointment where he wasn't asked about the abuse at all, despite that being the explicit reason for his appointment. He said, didn't ask the right questions, and I was in there for half an hour, which isn't very long, and didn't ask me one question that focused around abuse. I left there feeling worse than I went in. Even my partner commented, "What the hell are you doing out here already?" I don't want to judge the man, because there's not many people out there, bar people who have lived through the experience, that can actually help. So getting the help, like I said, I'm very lucky and blessed to have the help that I have now, because it just wasn't there before at all, in any way, shape or form. And so Andrew said, being talked to like I was just something out of the textbook. One regret I have had is that I made a clinical psychologist very uncomfortable because of how I was. And I was just sick of her talking to me like, call them desktop generals. There was no rapport, there was no connection. There was no real understanding. There was someone behind a desk and someone they had to see. Our final theme incorporates participants' views on what they gained through therapy for those 7 men who were able to develop a connection and reported benefit. They described changing thoughts and behaviours. They described changing perspective of themselves and perspectives of their abusers. For some, this involved recognising that they had experienced abuse. So as children, many of the participants believed that they were responsible, whereas this belief changed during therapy as they came to realise that someone had taken advantage of them and it was not their fault. So James said, I guess it's more just talking about it, and I guess the more I talk about it, the more I understand it as being abuse, because I've been going to this group for 1 year and 5 months and hear other people's stories or bits of their stories, and I always kind of feel like a fake, like a phony sitting there because I haven't been abused, because I enjoyed it and I kind of feel like I don't belong there sometimes. And I think that's what I'm learning with the counsellor. Even though I enjoyed it, doesn't mean it wasn't abuse. And participants also described changing their views of their abusers. Simon said, I think I came to understand it a lot differently. I also realised that both those people who did that to me have issues, and I was able to come to terms with that. That was a huge step. Participants also described changing their understanding of how their behaviour now was related to their earlier abuse. They began to understand and explain their reactions as a way of coping, rather than thinking that they were doing these things because there was something wrong with them. They began to make sense of their reactions in situations when they felt threatened or when they felt vulnerable, and understanding those reactions and how they were connected to the past allowed them to recognise and take control over those thoughts and those behaviours. So Ray said, a lot more understanding and acceptance of myself and what had happened, and that it wasn't my fault. And the things I had done were just simply trying to balance up the inequality of the power situation in it. That helped. And Lexington said, once I had identified it, I could then make more sense of my world. Over a period of a couple of years, the black holes where I couldn't speak got less and less, and they don't happen at all now. I'd spent my whole life trying to be lovable, and now I love myself. So instead of getting unconditional love from everyone in the world except me, I now love myself, which means I need less unconditional love from others. Kim described gaining insight into his reactions to other people. Initially, it was that I could see, I could know what was happening in me. So if I went down to the pub on a Friday night and began to feel really uncomfortable, I'd know why. Instead of just wanting to get the hell out of there. The nightmares got worse and the flashbacks got worse during therapy. But they certainly, when I stopped therapy, they were at a manageable level. I was sleeping better. People who knew me were sort of seeing me as more settled. And also, I just wasn't feeling this overwhelming shame. Like whenever a cop pulled me over, or someone told me off at work, or my partner went quiet for the day, I wasn't reacting to that by feeling, oh, I'm a piece of shit, I'm an awful person. So finally, in summary, the common barriers to therapy were stigma. So stigma about abuse, stigma about therapy, and stigma about seeking help as a man. Shame, fear of being disbelieved, fear of not being understood. And this connects with a number of things that we've heard today about the idea of what it means to be, what masculinity means, and how this can conflict with this experience of sexual abuse and experience of help seeking, and the way culturally we stigmatise help seeking. Therapists who didn't ask about abuse or who showed discomfort with sexual abuse potentially have the potential to do further harm to their clients, because avoiding the topic of sexual abuse can reinforce the idea that this is something that you can't talk about, it is something that's shameful, and it can reinforce this idea that vulnerability is dangerous as well. It isn't safe to talk about it, it isn't safe to be vulnerable. On the other hand, when a connection was developed, when there was connection made, the relationship itself with the therapist was part of the healing process. So having your story believed, having your story understood without judgment was a key part of that healing process and a key part of challenging shame. Another part of healing was honesty about the effects of the abuse on current, sometimes difficult to disclose thoughts and behaviours. But understanding those behaviours, understanding their connection to the past, allowed the men to develop insight and to develop compassion for themselves. And so finally, I think we'd like to both together acknowledge the participants who gave their time to tell their stories. Ken, obviously, and you want to get on, and Anna and Linda Hobbs, who contributed to this research.
I probably want to say a couple of wee words about that, especially in terms of the participants. So in terms of the courage and the strength to actually come forward and be able to talk with a clinical psychologist about all the experiences they've had, how huge that is and how valuable. So I'm a clinician. This gives me insight that I would never have had if they had not spoken freely. Also, as a family or a support worker or another person who survived abuse, here are some things that people can read and say, actually, I'm not alone. These experiences happen, and here are some of the things that people feel about it. I guess as a human being as well, that it's, for them to come forward and tell us that information, it helps me understand and be able to respond. I'd like to make a special mention to Ken. I don't know the story of how I met Ken, so the only reason I've done this research was related directly to Ken, because as you know, this silence he does not want anymore, and he is really big about making this all known in New Zealand. So the first time I met Ken was at a conference. I can't remember what it was, and he probably won't remember. It was a victim conference around childhood sexual abuse. I went there as an academic, but I'm not immune to what happens in people's lives. So in our family, there was sexual abuse and people were impacted. So anyway, I'm looking at the guest list, I'm looking at the speakers, and I see this guy called Ken Clearwater. I had no idea who he was. I thought, that looks an interesting talk. So I naively kind of meandered into the room, thinking this should be interesting. So Ken gets up, and the way that Ken gets up, starts talking, powerful. All of a sudden, he's talking about his own abuse. And basically, literally, it felt like the floor had fallen out from under me. So I thought I'd handled it all. I thought I was coping. I was like, I'm doing research, I get this, I can kind of work with this. But at that moment, I felt really vulnerable. Ken won't know this, but so after his talk, I went to the bathroom and I felt like a child and I cried. I'm like all these men, I think you have to be strong. So I kind of tried to get rid of the Teds really quick and then walked out the door. But that's how I first came to know Ken. And since that time, the involvement's gone on. So anything Ken has wanted me to do, I've been willing, and my awareness of all these issues has grown incredibly because of him. He's a co-investigator in this study, along with Anna and Linda and Charles. Thank you.